What happens when companies violate human rights? Should we hold the company that provided the Zyklon bead to the Auschwitz camp during the Second World War with the express knowledge that they knew that their chemicals were going to be used to exterminate millions and millions of Jews? Or what about the logistics company that provided the data infrastructure to the apartheid regime? To what extent can we say that they are accountable for perpetuating racial oppression in this country? These are serious questions and they need serious answers. How's it, guys? Welcome back to Set in Arbiter. My name is Gil, and on this channel we talk about the law, how it is, why it is, and what it could be. This video is really just meant to give you a brief introductory video into an interesting area of law that I'm doing a lot of research on this year, and as I learn more, hopefully I can give you more videos on this type of content. It's a really prevalent area of law, but it's also an area that lacks in satisfactory answers. So we start off on the basis that the primary role of the state is to realize human rights for its people. That whether that be through economic growth, but they democratically elected to do that. But as time goes on, it becomes increasingly obvious that the state are unable to do this all on their own. And this is not to say that we should take the spotlight off of the state, no, not at all. They should definitely stop being so corrupt and careless and inefficient and ineffective, and stop wasting an hour of our time on ridiculous points of order in Parliament, like as if we don't have better things to do. But there seems to be this trend that powerful multinational corporations have some role to play in society in realizing human rights. The persistent problem, however, is defining what exactly is this role that multinational corporations play, and how do we hold them accountable if and when they violate human rights. So in this video, you're going to learn three things. Firstly, what exactly is the problem that multinational corporations put in front of us? What is the law's response to that problem? And lastly, where are we headed? What is the problem that multinational corporations put in front of us? To understand the problem, you need to know two fundamental characteristics of a company. The first is that they have their own separate legal personality, which means that they can sue and be sued in their own name. They can acquire rights and obligations separate from the people that own and run the company. Essentially they are their own person, and they can do almost everything that you and I can do. Obviously, to an extent, right? A company can't go and marry someone like you and I could, but they can do their own thing. And importantly, they can own their own stuff. All right, and now the second important characteristic about companies is that the shareholders, the people that own the companies, have limited liability. And that means is that the people that own the company, they're only liable for the company's debts to the extent of their own contributions. So in effect, for example, if a company went under, it's bankrupt, and they owe creditors a lot of money, they owe people a lot of money, and those creditors come and they want to get their money back, the company can't pay them back, and they can't now come after the shareholders for all their money back. And in that way, it protects the person, it protects the shareholder. The problem is at the intersection where these two concepts meet. And essentially what that means is where companies are now using their separate legal personality to buy other companies. In other words, one company can own another company. And in effect, it turns the limited liability doctrine on its head. Instead of now the doctrine protecting the person, it now protects the enterprise. And we have a situation where you can get a parent company that owns multiple different subsidiary companies underneath it, making it a really wealthy and extremely large and complicated enterprise. So companies can use this legal framework to grow even bigger. I mean, it coincides with things like the rise in capitalism and technological innovations, but they truly are today massive non-state actors. They're big players in the global field, so much so that the top 15 corporations in the world have a larger revenue than every single nation, or all but 13 nations, which is a crazy stat, which means that most times that if let's say for example a multinational corporation decides to do business in Africa, the corporation is going to be more powerful, more rich than the country that it operates in. It becomes and that's the situation you have, and you have to understand that the traditional view is that companies objective is single, is that they need to make money for their shareholders, and this pursuit of profit has in many instances led to human rights violations, as I may have outlined at the beginning of this video, but also because it leads to things like child labor and poor working conditions and low pay, or in effect or supporting a oppressive regime in the long run, right? And this problem can be compounded when you realize that the host country, the country that they're working in, let's say whether that be in Africa or the Philippines or in South America, one of those as they say the third world countries, a lot of the time there's poor labor rights in these countries, no strong independent judiciary, no free media, and so often they're so desperate for the foreign investment that the company comes in to the country and immediately they have such political and economic clout, and they're almost untouchable in a lot of ways, right? And so you've got to understand, so now we've got this limited liability thing and the separate personality, but also there is a jurisdictional problem. So where a company through the subsidiary, right, it's the parent company is not going to commit these human rights violations, but let's say the subsidiary is the one that in effect messes up environmental issues in a country, or employs child laborers and things like that. It becomes a jurisdictional issue. How do you sue the parent company? The court is going to say, well, the parent company didn't commit the harm. Why are you suing them? And you in effect, you can only really end up suing the subsidiary company. You can only get the foot soldier at the very best, right? And an analogy I can make for you is that, think of it like the rhino poachers, right? You can kill a rhino poacher, and you may be happy about that, but you can kill a rhino poacher, but that's not going to stop the next rhino poacher from coming in the next day and taking his place. The real problem is the suppliers and the dealers at the top of the rhino supply chain that are the real problem. And as long as they stay in power, as long as they remain untouched, you're always just going to keep getting new rhino poachers, and that is essentially the problem that this limited liability and the separate legal personality and this jurisdictional problem presents for anyone trying to enforce human rights obligations against the multinational corporation. So what is the law's response to this problem that I've outlined for you? And the first thing you need to know is that international law is fundamentally based on interstate relations. That's what it was initially made for, which means that there's a lot of mechanisms and instruments that we can use to either compel a state or incentivize a state to protect human rights. But there isn't necessarily anything concrete to do the same thing in the private sphere, to hold multinational corporations to the same standard as we do to the state. So often international law decision makers will look at the corporation in conjunction with the government. So they'll say, is the corporation acting as an agent for the government? Is it being complicit with the government? Are they using government forces to abuse human rights in the country? Something like that. If in effect they're looking at whether the corporation is being used to violate state's obligation. However, where the corporation, where the state has no involvement, or at least the involvement isn't clear, then it becomes problematic because the international law doesn't really have an effective law enforcement mechanism against the multinational corporation on its own. And in effect, they leave it to the country itself to deal with. They say domestically you need to implement legislation and law to regulate this thing. The problem is, again, like I already outlined to you, that it's not necessarily in the host country's interest to hold them liable and accountable and to high standards of human rights protection. And in that way, there is no answer. The answer to the problem is that the law doesn't really have a real effective answer, and that's just the situation we're in at the moment. This is not necessarily all doom and gloom as I may have outlined it for you. Generally, there is a consensus among many multinational corporations that respecting human rights is good for business. And whether that be for their reputation or for a productive workforce, they generally get the idea, right? And since the 1980s, 1990s, to early 2000s, and all the way till now, we start seeing companies start playing a more active role, right? And they do things like they incorporate voluntary codes of conduct, and they invest in these corporate social responsibility programs and all this and that. The problem, however, is that there isn't really an independent authority overlooking to see whether these projects and these initiatives actually translate into meaningful ethical practice on the ground. There's no one really overlooking to see that is this actually good for people? Is what you're doing really good? So you have to understand that at the moment, the responsibility for the corporations sits in the realm of charity. It sits in the realm of virtuousness. We do this because we want to help. It's good that we want to help, and in a lot of ways that is a nice way to look at it. But for me, I see that there's a growing trend, and it becomes more and more concrete as the years go by, that there's going to be a positive obligation on corporations. And what I mean by that is that it becomes more so than in the realm of charity, and we move it to the realm of justice. In other words, at the core of these CSR projects, at the core of everything the business does, needs to be in line with human rights. And when we understand it from that perspective, it becomes an essential obligation for the company to do this, which means that if they don't respect human rights and they don't promote and they don't help realize human rights in the country in which they operate in, there can be serious sanctions against them. For me, that's where I think we're going. I could be wrong, and I'd love for you guys to let me know. What do you think? Do you think that the state should be the only ones realizing human rights, or do you think that there is a role that companies should play, and to what extent should that role be? I think that role is that one day it's going to be an absolute obligation for them to do this, not some charitable thing that they can do on the side. But that's just me. Let me know what you guys think, and like, subscribe, comments, share if you can, and I'll always leave you with the final message that the law is only a tool, whether that is for good or for bad, and its real usefulness, just like any tool, depends on those who know how to use it and understand it. Cheers for now, guys.